Wars and threats of wars. A doctor's masked face looms over me. Metal clinks. He must be searching for the right instrument. The smell of antiseptic invades my nostrils, and a soggy sheet cling to my back. I must be in surgery at the hospital in Oran. Wait, my injuries aren't severe enough to warrant surgery. Stop! How dare they do this against my will? I try to call out, but I'm paralysed. With a stupendous force of will, I force myself awake. A nightmare, just another nightmare from the war. Shapes assembled themselves into beds and chairs and a night table with a lamp. I flicked it on and tried to make sense of what had happened. The vapours of anaesthetic were real. I knew where I was, Belize City, and the date was either June 17th or 18, 1976. I could hear radio music and my wife chatting in the next room, unaware of my drama. Something wasn't right, the keys to the van and my wallet missing. I rushed to the balcony and peered over the side. Odd, the van was still parked below. Maybe I can catch them before they drive off, I shouted. Still groggy, I stumbled downstairs and ran to the car. Unbelievably, it was still there with the key in the door. I guess they don't know how to drive a stick shift, I bellowed. Inside the van, everything was gone, including my precious tools and the spare. I was pumped up and ready to take back my property if I could find the thieves. But they weren't taking any more chances. I had heard the sound of my tyre rolling away, but I couldn't pinpoint where the robbers were in the maze of little houses across the street. Their haste with the tyre set off waves of staccato barking by guard dogs under the tiny stilted houses. I ran upstairs and yelled, "We've been robbed!" Our new maid, Beverly, was teaching Jean how to braid cornrows on a model who was her old friend. "Welcome to Belize, Mon," Beverly said. "You're lucky they no thief, you clothes." Her young friend nodded her head of shiny twists and coils in agreement. "The kids!" Jean yelled as she rushed to the children's rooms. I ran after her. "They're okay," we both whispered as we looked through their doorways. Given the layout of the apartment, I was certain the robbers hadn't been in there. The audacity of those guys. The fact that they boldly entered our bedroom and sprayed me with anaesthetic while I was asleep made me furious. I slammed out the door and stamped down the halls of the Young Women's Christian Association building where we lived. Then I thumped downstairs. A new school would open down there in August. As the administrator, I took responsibility for the building because the Young Women's Christian Association didn't even have a janitor. The building had been empty for 2 years, sorely neglected and repeatedly vandalised. All of the light bulbs and much of the hardware and plumbing were missing. As I checked for unlocked doors and windows, I thought that workmen could have left one open. They hadn't. My anger boiled over. We had come to Belize to help the poor, but at this rate we would soon be as poor as they. This was the most daring of the robberies our group had experienced in our first 2 weeks. 3 other adults and 2 more children had accompanied us in a convoy of Volkswagen vans from Austin, Texas, to Belize. None of us had a clue that we would be discriminated against or robbed. When we crossed into Belize, the Creole customs officer pointed at our brown-complexioned twins and said, "I like their colour," indicating his attitude toward whites. His statement disappointed me. Shouldn't he have said, "Welcome to Belize, Mon"? We were on a mission to help his people. The majority of Belizeans were Creoles, Harry Belafonte types of African and English heritage. The rest were mainly Hispanics from Guatemala and East Indians whose forefathers were indentured servants. Mayan Indians, the original inhabitants, as well as British whites and Chinese merchants comprised the minority. All of these ethnicities, religions and cultures would enrich our lives as we got to know people. But as soon as we unpacked, we discovered that we were disliked by a lot of Creoles. In their minds, all white people were British, and they despised them. Belize wanted independence from Great Britain after years of colonisation. As I was a former German citizen, as well as a former enemy of the British, this new label was ironic. For the first time in our lives, Jean and I felt the sting of racial prejudice. We were the last to be waited on in Creole-owned businesses, and sometimes they wouldn't serve us at all. We did as much business as we could with the friendly Chinese, who waited on everybody. "I wish they would get to know me before they decide to hate me," Jean had said, and stopped herself. That's exactly what a minority of colour would say in the United States. Prejudice toward us is temporary. When we leave, we won't feel it anymore. For people of colour in the United States, though, it will never go away. Even though prejudice against whites was common, we had made the acquaintance of Creoles in the neighbourhood. We knew that not everyone hated whites. Our colour didn't attract the robbers as much as my naivete. I should have taken more precautions. I was still mad enough to take on a gorilla. Adrenaline coursed through my body. The thieves must have shinnied up the posts of our balcony. I had second thoughts about this assignment. My little children came first, and now that our space had been invaded, I worried about their safety. In a surge of protectiveness, I went to take another look at my sweetly sleeping children. Kirk was stretched out on his back, getting the full benefit of the breeze from the window. His blonde hair curled around his face in damp wisps. His skin was so white it was almost translucent. Our son had inherited the looks of our German and Swedish ancestors. He was 3 years old and already spoke phrases in the Creole dialect. I checked on my twin daughters. 2-year-old Tatiana and Rosanna were sleeping in identical positions, curled on their sides at the moment, their long black hair flowing across their pillows. My rage swelled up again at the thought of this intrusion. I would protect my family at all costs. When day dawned, I was going to find a safer place to live and report the robbery. The police wouldn't knock themselves out for a foreigner, but I was going to complain as a matter of form. After all, I was the son of a policeman. I had no illusions about the recovery of our possessions. This wasn't the first time my identification was stolen. In Africa, British soldiers had appropriated it. I walked out to the balcony, still too nervous to go back to sleep. Thousands of frogs and crickets filled the air with creaks and squeaks, while giant land crabs scraped and scuttled around the concrete building. Their sounds mingled with the splash of little waves that lapped up on the beach. Reflections of the moon were mirrored in the blackness of the quiet Caribbean Sea. My thoughts were still on the welfare of my children. I reminisced on how our lives had changed after Kirk came along. He had been such an unusually alert, happy, easygoing baby. We enjoyed his babyhood, and we believed that he would appreciate a sibling later on. Zero population growth was promoted. At that time we had already had our limit of 2 children. Rather than produce another child, we decided to adopt instead. Every week there seemed to be an adoption story in the news about children orphaned by the war in Korea. But when we called local adoption agencies, we were turned down. We were too old and already had too many children to qualify for an Asian orphan. When Jean talked about our rejection with a former colleague from Colombia, South America, she learned where we could adopt instead. Colombia had been torn apart by a 14-year civil war fought by 2 opposing political parties. In the 50s, political leaders, families, and even whole villages had been massacred during this period termed La Violencia. The violence. Homes and jobs were destroyed. The resultant poverty led to serious consequences. Desperate mothers who feared for their babies' survival tried to give them to passers-by or abandoned them in hospitals and public places. A generation of orphans lived on the streets. 20 years after the violence, the orphan problem had not abated. 3-year-olds carried babies on their shoulders and begged on the streets and sidewalks. Hundreds of orphanages were filled to capacity. I leaned against the balcony railing. My mind was still in Bogotá, where I had found an all-consuming purpose for my life. I had suffered through a lot of violence and deprivation myself, but I had never seen an endless cycle of poverty that forced thousands of mothers, with no hope in sight, to live on the streets and to abandon their children. Our Colombian friend discovered that an international adoption agency in her hometown had a set of newborn twins who needed parents. As soon as we could manage it, we travelled to Colombia to adopt them. At the house of mother and child, the founder and director placed Tatiana and Rosanna, our tiny 2-month-old twins, in our arms for the first time. Dressed in long white christening gowns, the infants smiled and cooed. Their black hair, brown almond-shaped eyes and tan skin captivated my wife and me. "Do you like them?" the director asked. "We love them," we said at the same time. What a question. We had never seen a picture of them, but they were exactly as Jean and I had imagined. We hoped that the adoption would be finalised as soon as possible. During our wait for the final decree, we stayed with the aunt of Jean's former colleague. An upper-class Orthodox European Jewish family, their grandparents had immigrated to Colombia to escape persecution prior to World War II. I'm sure that they realised that I had been a German soldier because of my age, but my past never came up. They were gracious hosts who included us in their daily activities, meals and religious observances. The hostess, who was a social worker by profession, talked about her efforts to settle Russian Jews in Colombia. She told us that babies like ours faced a dismal future if they were never adopted. As we drove around Bogotá on our adoption appointments, we saw endless heartbreaking scenes of children living on the streets. Our month in Bogotá made a lasting impression. The faces of all the hapless, homeless children engraved themselves in my mind. When the adoption decree was finally granted, we bundled up our 3 infants and boarded a plane home with a sigh of relief. The twins were ours. At the last moment, the director's daughter pressed photos of 8 children who needed families in my hands and changed my life forever. "Will you show these to your adoption agency in Minnesota to see if they have parents interested in Colombian orphans?" she asked. At first, I wanted to blurt, "Not now." I didn't know if I would have time to work with Children's Home Society of Minnesota, the adoption agency that conducted our social study. I would need to spend time with them to explain what they needed to know about the process in order to coordinate this type of adoption. I might have to look for a job first. My employer was probably unhappy with me, since I had taken a leave of absence, not knowing when I'd be back. I already had a night job. The twins still needed to be fed every 3 hours. Kirk was at a different developmental level at the age of 11 months and also needed a lot of attention. I gladly gave my wife the break she needed for at least 6 hours at night. Nevertheless, my hand seemed to reach for the orphan's pictures of its own accord. In a flash of intuition, I came to the conclusion that God had a purpose for me and it was my destiny and obligation to carry it out. "We'll find good homes for them, Senora. I'm sure we will," I heard myself saying as I put the photos in my briefcase. The photos catapulted me toward a higher purpose. The twins' adoption paved the way for thousands of Colombian orphans to find homes in the United States. In less than 6 months, the adoption agency found parents for all 8 children, and as a volunteer, I coached the prospective parents through the international steps. Word about Colombia's orphans spread, and I soon was asked to volunteer for several more agencies, and to write an article on Colombian adoptions for News of Ours, Organization for a United Response, an adoptive parents' newsletter. The article opened the portals to Colombia for waiting parents. Even though Jean had 3 babies to care for, she joined the adoption support group, later called Adoptive Families of America, AFA, and volunteered to help out from home. AFA was founded by adoptive parents of children orphaned after the Korean War. Later on, they took up the cause of children orphaned by the war in Vietnam. On one memorable occasion, the group hosted a seminar presented by a nurse, Rosemary Taylor. Her stories, photos, and slides of the Vietnamese orphanages shocked the audience. Because of my own experience with war and bombings, I was against this war in far-off Southeast Asia. On top of it, I had 2 sons old enough to be drafted. My most fervent wish was that the war would end before my boys were called up. Miss Taylor's humanitarian service impressed me. I wasn't quite sure how, but someday I wanted to make a meaningful contribution in Vietnam. In the meantime, demonstrations against the war grew larger and louder. As I hooked my hands over the railing of the balcony, I remembered other opponents of war, the Society of Friends, or Quakers. I respected them because of their passive demonstrations and spirituality. Conversations with the Friends made me realize how much I had neglected my spiritual side. Prompts from within led me to take time out to study religion. Christian thought and philosophy had already revealed enormous gaps in my knowledge. Not only that, ever since I had visited the mosque in Tunisia and met Jewish people after I immigrated, I felt a tremendous urge to understand the tenets of Judaism and Islam. All three religions originated in Palestine. What was so different and so important that believers of one faith were willing to kill believers of another creed in the name of the same God? I applied for and received a grant to study at the Earlham School Religion, a Quaker seminary in Richmond, Indiana. From my vantage point, I could see the blackness of the Caribbean Sea lighten to navy blue. I remembered how we had bundled up our 3 toddlers and moved to Richmond. During my year there, I tried to understand where the Spirit might lead me. I knew that I was too blunt, impatient, and outspoken to be a minister or director of religion. My contribution would be international outreach, plans, budgets, organisation, and administration. Somewhere, I believed, I would find a way to use my skills to benefit others. At Earlham, comparative religious studies whetted my interest. Memories of men in Oran and Tunisia who dropped their work to answer the call to worship 5 times a day was a powerful reminder of how differently we worship, yet how important God is in our daily lives. Moreover, the forbidding memories of films I had seen at Fort Knox on the atrocities committed by my countrymen against Jews were embedded in my mind. After a year of studies in the Torah, the Quran, and the Bible, I was sure of one thing. Humankind must know and understand one another if we are ever going to stop fighting each other. Real people emerge, their colour just as worthy, their religious beliefs just as valued, and their rights just as important. Such are the theories that I still hold today, but only a saint could practice them in Belize, and I wasn't a saint. From my perch on the balcony, I could see the first rays of the sun touching houses along the beachfront. I thought about my last months at Earlham. I was asked if we would be willing to serve for a year in Belize, formerly British Honduras, with the Christian Social Council in Belize City, while their director, Miss Matty, stayed on at Earlham to complete her degree in ministry. Miss Matty hadn't been back to Belize for 2 years. Otherwise, she would have known that this place was unfit for human habitation. Off in the distance, the sea and sky faded to a pale blue. Behind the balcony door, Beverly clattered about in the kitchen and snapped me out of my reveries. She would need water, and I always carried it upstairs for her. Belizeans got up at 6 or earlier in order to get their work done before the worst of the heat blazed through the windows. She was only 18, but a good cook, neat and orderly. We had no idea how to treat a maid, so we treated her like a daughter. She had no idea how to relate to us either, so she treated us like the parents she never had. She had grown up with her grandmother in a 2-room shack hammered together with unpainted boards, as did all the Belizean poor. As I watched the sun's rays touch the balcony, I wondered why I had fallen under Miss Matty's spell. My religious studies must have mellowed me. Now my scepticism was back. Matty had mentioned a drought, but not how it might affect us. The rainy season was late, and the rainwater collectors on the roofs and the storage tanks were empty. This meant that we had to take pails down a flight of stairs to the outside water faucet and wait for the city to turn on the water. Daily living was much more difficult than we could ever have anticipated. I left the balcony and took 2 pails down so that I could bring up water for the household. As I watched rusty-looking water slowly fill the first pail, I thought about all of my reasons for being there. English-speaking Belize seemed like the perfect place to begin a lifetime of humanitarian missions. I expected a relaxed lifestyle overseas, where I could spend a lot of time with our children while I taught survival skills to the poor and helped find American families for homeless children. After my term of employment was up, Belize would be our stepping stone to other Latin American countries. I wasn't ready to quit. After breakfast, I looked for a secure house to rent. Within hours, I found a nice big duplex in a better part of town that had hot and cold running water. We moved in the next day and relaxed. Now we could get on with our work for the Christian Council. No one would bother us here the property was fenced in, and the landlord was rumoured to have a permit for a gun. Our salary didn't cover the rent, but I paid for it myself with the expectation that the mission board would advance money to cover it. Fortunately, they did. Baptist, Episcopalian, and Methodist churches in the United States enthusiastically supported the Christian Council's projects. Each denomination had built a church in Belize City. On Sundays, we took the children to visit different churches. At the end of the service, ushers collected the hymn books. When I asked a member of the Christian Council seated next to me why they picked up the hymnals, she said, "If they don't, the parishioners they've the songbooks." Why when the books are here anyway? It makes a person feel good to carry the songbook into the church, like, "This is me hymn book." I tried to imagine how I would feel or behave if I had to live like the poor did. The elderly were robbed repeatedly until they had nothing left but the clothes on their backs. Pitiful octogenarians stayed with relatives and slept on the floor. When even their blankets were stolen, they came to the Christian Council for another one. They had to get on a waiting list. How could the standard of living ever improve, I wondered? Undeveloped countries like this had little to offer in the way of jobs. Most of the men lounged about, chronically unemployed. The women kept their men and children housed and fed. Creole women supported children fathered by a series of common-law husbands. Aunts and grandmothers were the repository of biographical information. At every social gathering, they swapped information and identified the paternity of each and every child. Some children were virtually homeless. Their mothers left on job searches and didn't return for years. The children slept wherever relatives could make room on the floor. The situation was so wretched that I talked to the local welfare authorities about children I knew, and I visited the orphanages. They were full, they said. They didn't want any more children. I was told that if a mother with no means of support tried to leave her newborn in the hospital for safekeeping, they hunted her down and gave the baby back to her or the closest relative. That put the baby in jeopardy. Since the poor couldn't afford to buy manufactured formula, babies were fed water spiked with sweetened condensed milk. If they managed to survive, they got a free elementary school education. Tuition was required beyond primary school. The school we had been assigned to was the British equivalent of a vocational school. A young carpenter who had helped drive the van to Belize completed the repairs on the classrooms in the Young Women's Christian Association just in time for opening day. The plumbing still didn't work, and the red dust that blew in from the drought settled faster than it could be cleaned up. But the school opened anyway, and 40 students, who ranged in age from 13 to 15, assembled for an orientation. They were freshly scrubbed, smoothly coiffed, and togged out in white polyester uniforms and knee socks. The Creole superintendent made it clear that she had the same rules and expectations for the students at this school as the public school that the girls had dropped out of. "This is your last chance," she said as she glared at her huddled students. She ended with the admonition, "Your uniform must be kept spotless." John gave me a nudge. Why on earth did they choose white for the uniforms? How can they possibly keep them clean in a place like this? I shrugged. The poor of Belize, who carried their water home from a community faucet one pail at a time, were the most immaculately groomed people we had ever seen. To me, a more pressing problem was that the school, like others in Belize, did not have books for all of the courses. Those subjects were taught by rote, which left no time for creative ideas or discussion. The girls were polite and never said a word unless asked. Even then, it was hard to get a word out of them. I had pictured the school as a warm and friendly place that would help young people get back on their feet, but the Creole teachers were cold and strict with our impoverished students. I tried to get them to consider the girls' living conditions before they made such excessive demands on them, but my entreaties were rebuffed. Like the British colonists, the Creoles had a set of class distinctions to uphold. Educated Creoles did not mix with the lower class. Money for material and salaries for native teachers came from the Quaker Women's Organization and the Council of Churches. Our small salary also came from these sources. Jean taught crafts and sewing, and I was the administrator. In addition to administrative work, I also provided training for jobs in sales and bookkeeping. I wrote my own texts. In a few short years, the girls would most likely join the ranks of unwed mothers, so I also taught them how to shop. Prices were high because everything was imported via ships, mostly from British Commonwealth countries, and brought to the docks on barges. When I talked about shopping, the girls finally raised their hands. At last, a subject hit home. They had questions because the poor bought everything in small amounts. Their mothers were paid by the day and lived a day-to-day existence. Shopkeepers took boxes and packages apart and sold the contents piece by piece. This satisfied the immediate needs of the buyers, but they usually paid too much for the article. To illustrate, I brought my purchases to school and asked the girls to bring theirs in order to compare prices. We compared what they paid for one ponytail binder to the whole package I bought for my daughters. Mon, you know how to save money. Mr. Eriksson, how much you pay for cologne? Asked Jackie, my most talkative student. She had me stumped and she knew it. This was the female's one luxury, and it seemed like everyone in school smelled fantastic on account of all the cologne imported from Great Britain. Other than walking around in a cloud of sweet-smelling fragrances, their lives were pretty grim. Whole families lived on the money their mothers brought home as maids and laundresses. Playing store in my class was a game they liked. They brought to class little quarter-pound cellophane bags of their staples, oatmeal, rice and beans, and we compared what they paid per ounce for their little bag and what I paid for £10. To hear them get mad about how they were overcharged was music to my ears. I'm sure the shopkeepers hate me still. When you buy so much at once, be sure you put it in a glass or a tin so Charlie Price don't get it, Jackie reminded the class. It took me 2 weeks after I first arrived in Belize to figure out who Charlie Price was, a humorous euphemism to refer to thousands of rats bigger than cats that plagued the city. Unbelievably, when I tried to buy enough rat poison to eliminate them from the Young Women's Christian Association, I found that the poison was rationed. I had to get tough with the Government Department of Health and Welfare in order to get twice my allotment, since the amount I needed wasn't for a house, it was for a big building. The amount I finally got out of them still wasn't enough to kill off even half of the rats. Charlie Prices were always in a twitch for scraps that everyone, including Beverly, tossed out the windows when I turned my back. If you feed them outside, they won't come inside, she claimed. Beverly was ordinarily a smart girl. She had finished school and needed a job, as her grandmother had supported her since she was a little girl and taught her to be an accomplished homemaker. Beverly was also kind and patient with children. Ours attended an international nursery school during the half-day that we taught. Beverly was also a good cook, but she usually wanted to make the Belizean staple every day: coconut rice, black beans, and an occasional fish. In a quest for more variety, John found that some middle-class Belizeans had home freezers from which they sold homemade ice cream and beef. A Guatemalan family at the end of our block had a wizened Indian maid, too feeble to do more than answer the door. When Jean asked about the maid, the pretty Spanish lady of the house answered, "My father bought her in an Indian village when she was 10 years old. He gave her to me when I got married. Now she's so old she's not good for much, but we have to keep her. She has nowhere to go." Jean came home in a state of shock. "I didn't know what to say. I've never met a slave or a slave owner before. Is it legal here?" She always made certain that Beverly only worked 8 hours a day or less, and that she had every weekend off. She knew her job, and we never ordered her about. She was treated like family, and she ate at the table with us. We were a team. The work involved in a house with no labour-saving devices was too much for one person. It took all 3 of us to keep everything running smoothly. When Beverly found a job as a clerk in a retail store, we were happy for her. We searched for a new helper and found Amelia, a young Guatemalan who'd immigrated to Belize with her mother. Amelia was related to an Episcopalian priest who visited her at our house and invited us to stay at his mission one weekend. We took this as divine guidance. Here was an opportunity to see if we could find better working conditions elsewhere. My drive through Petén in Guatemala to Lake Izabal started just as the rains came and the rivers were high. Markers showed shallow places where buses and trucks drove through, but they left wakes like ships. Our van was too low. We were told to cross the river over a hanging bridge. I had reservations when I noticed that the crossings drew male spectators from the nearby village. But maybe they didn't have television. A macho young guy strutted up and offered to drive our bus across for a small fee. "What if he just keeps going?" Jean whispered. "That's a risk I'm willing to take," I said, as I looked at his smiling face and handed him the keys. Applause went up when he reached the other side. We followed on foot. He slid open the doors for us and jumped out and took a bow for his moments of bravado. As we travelled deeper into Piten, Guatemalan troops, mostly Mayans, were everywhere. One of them stood in the middle of the road and made it clear that he wanted a ride by holding his submachine gun crosswise over his head. Jean slid the door open for him. In no time, Amelia was chatting happily and feeding him tidbits out of our picnic basket. At a crossroad miles away, we let him off, and he joined a contingent of soldiers. Amelia told us that he had bragged, "We're taking back our territory, your country of Belize." Further down the road lay a beautiful mission in the jungle surrounded by Quechua Maya villages. The place we visited was an Episcopalian mission called Life, for Lake Isabel farming and educational mission. We spent a wonderful few days feeling welcome and accepted as we toured the botanical projects, visited the priests, and even attended a village birthday party for the priest's 2-year-old daughter with about 100 Guatemalans and Mayans. Best of all, we didn't feel any prejudice. All too soon we had to go back. When we came to the hanging bridge, not a soul was in sight. I told John to bring the children, our passports and money after I crossed. The boards flapped as I drove as slowly as possible, stopping, watching and listening for a collapse. The bridge was obviously much stronger than it looked. In retrospect, maybe I should have floored it. As we pulled up to the Guatemalan-Belizean checkpoint, we saw large troop concentrations. While we stood around waiting for customs to clear us, Amelia caught the soldiers' attention, and they ambled over to talk to her. Later, she told us some of the soldiers showed off and bragged, "We're coming to your country to kill all those black people and get our territory back from the British." Belize City was in a whirlwind of activity when we returned. Air transports had delivered troops from Great Britain. Harrier aircraft were now stationed at the airport to beef up the tiny British garrison, and anti-aircraft guns were set up on the waterfront. The following weekend, we took the kids to the beach. Belizeans lounged about with their picnics and looked unconcerned as we stared unbelievingly at British soldiers who hauled anti-aircraft guns to the beach and camouflaged them with netting. Behind their backs, the Belizeans hooted and called the British cheese faces. John leaned over to me and said, "Honey, these heavily armed soldiers and guns make me nervous." Déjà vu, I thought, and to her I said, "You're not kidding. This looks serious." From a strategic standpoint, I could see that Belize City was easy pickings. Swamps surrounded a city built mostly of wood on 3 sides. When I heard the first air raid siren go off the following week, I went to visit the American consul. He agreed that there was no protection or any shelter provided against bombing raids by the Guatemalan Air Force. "Don't worry, I'll send a messenger if things start going bad." When I got home after my conversation with the consul, I told Jean how insecure he made me feel. I can just picture an old guy like our postman, riding his broken-down bicycle like he's Paul Revere, shouting, "The Guatemalans are coming! The Guatemalans are coming!" It was up to me to decide when to leave and how. In the meantime, at least the Vietnam War had finally ended. The Miami Herald announced the takeover of South Vietnam by the North with reunification as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. I slapped the paper down on the table. What was I doing here? I had opposed war only to find my family in another country in a situation that could lead to hostilities. On our Christmas leave, we took the children to Florida for medical checkups. Once a specimen judged fit for tropical service in Africa, I was having dizzy spells. The children didn't have any symptoms, but they, too, were diagnosed with intestinal parasites. We had already decided not to return Belize. Jean and I tried to put the experience in perspective. What did we learn? The only thing we could come up with that might be of benefit later was that we were more aware of the problems of the poor. We had seen firsthand why mothers relinquish or abandon their children. Never to be forgotten was the fact that we had taken too much for granted and put ourselves in a precarious position. We should have insisted on more information from other sources, particularly from Americans who had lived there. Of course, no one could have predicted that Guatemala would choose that moment in history to reclaim Belize. Later on, I read in the Minneapolis Tribune that Guatemala backed off and the British contingent withdrew. Several years later, Belize achieved independence. Belize, as well as Colombia, reinforced what I already knew, that America is the most wonderful country in the world. Jean and I had time to discuss our future as we travelled back to Richmond, Indiana, to resign from our contract. Our belongings were shipped by shrimp boat to Miami. From Richmond, we returned to Minneapolis. The first job I was offered was an accountant's position for the divisional headquarters of the Salvation Army, and I took it. Several months later, I returned to Miami to clear our bus and belongings through customs. After my long drive home, Jean and I tried to clarify our future goals. If we couldn't work on humanitarian aid and adoption overseas, we would find ways to help from home. John told me about a master's degree program she had heard about that might give us a leg up in humanitarian service. One night after the kids were in bed, she hauled out a big folder of information from St. Mary's College in Winona, Minnesota. We can attend their week-long orientation this summer on your vacation. And what are you and I supposed to study? Human development. I've already checked this out with the head of the department. Instead of working on counselling techniques like the rest of the students, we can research and write a thesis on adoption in Latin America. How long is this going to take? I'm pretty sure that we can graduate in 2 or 3 years. How much is this going to cost? Jean held the fee schedule behind her back. A lot. I've talked to the school about this too. We can get a college loan and have it paid back by the time the kids graduate from high school. Then we can reapply for the kids with our excellent credit, she said with a laugh. By the next morning, I made up my mind to do it. The kids heard us talk about it as they ate their Captain Crunch. Kirk's eyes danced with excitement. He asked, "Are you going to school too, Daddy?" Tatiana started to giggle. "Will you and Mom take the school bus?" "No, silly," said Rosanna, whom they called the smart one. "They know how to drive. They'll take the car. They were too young and playful to notice our new economies. We cut up our credit cards and shopped at rummage sales instead of department stores for the next 3 years. We earned some required credits at Metropolitan State University in St. Paul, Minnesota, before we enrolled at St. Mary's. Jean managed her schoolwork during the day when the kids were at school, and I dove in after I came home from my job. Sometimes, around midnight, I would pour my 3rd cup of coffee and ask myself if the money and effort I expended would be worth it. The answer always came back to my haggard head as an unequivocal yes. The project hummed along as planned. Together we graduated from St. Mary's College in 1980, quickly turned in our gowns, and rushed back to Minneapolis to pick up the kids and celebrate with them at a pizza place that featured an entertainer on a pipe organ who played all the songs they knew. Rosanna told us earnestly, "Someday I'm going to graduate and I'll give everybody lots of pizza and songs too." Rosie was the first to graduate from college and was just as playful. She wore a toy diamond tiara afterwards. Her nickname is Chibcha Indian Princess. After many attempts, John found a publisher for our thesis, and the book, titled Gamins, How to Adopt from Latin America, became the first version of the How to Adopt Internationally books that have been in print ever since. Social workers, lawyers, and adoptive parents have written us to say that the books were their Bibles when they were trying to locate an orphan or to coordinate an adoption. After we graduated, we were granted a child-placing license in June of 1981 as a non-profit corporation, Los Niños, Children's International Aid and Adoption Agency. We did not expect to make any money, nor did we anticipate much activity. Jean was most interested in the aid of orphans in third world countries and to research, write and speak on international adoption. In the meantime, I got back in the workforce as an international accountant and later as cost manager with St. Mary's Hospital in Minneapolis. A job offer with the comptroller at Seton Hospital brought us to Austin, Texas in 1982. Jean applied for a Texas child placing license, which was granted in the same year. Later, she earned social work certification. Prospective adoptive parents in Texas started calling her as soon as the telephone was hooked up. While she gathered a clientele and took care of our home and children, I put in long hours on my new job and helped her on weekends. One night when I came home after another 12-hour day, she sat up in bed and told me some startling news. "You can quit your day job. Why don't you resign and help me? I've got more work than I can handle." "Can we afford it?" "Yes. I bank all the fees. Even after we pay the foreign adoption expenses, there's enough for your salary, starting now." She had never paid herself, hadn't even had time to think about it, and the funds accumulated. 2 weeks later, I was self-employed. For the first time, I helped our 3 children get ready for school. "Don't you go to work anymore, Daddy?" Kirk wanted to know. "Yes, I'm going to work, but I'm going to work at home." "That's good. Can I go to school at home too?" "Ah, I don't think so. Your mom and I don't know how to teach elementary school. Your teacher knows more about it than we do." I was itching to put my knowledge of non-profits to work in order to build up Los Niños. It grew as fast as a kudzu vine, with tendrils that spread through Texas, branched over every state, sprayed across Latin America, and eventually reached over oceans to Asia and to Eastern Europe. Within a few weeks, I rented an office, hired a secretary, renamed the agency Los Niños International Adoption Center, and arranged the first of many adoption seminars throughout the state. Later, I would add 9 more professional and clerical staff to provide full adoption services. I was a long way from my destructive safari in North Africa. This was my first step in a safari to save children. It was like an epiphany.